All right, we are back and we are at the highlight of what is turning out to be a conference full of highlights. Reminds me sort of Seneca's letter number 33, when his friend Lucilius is asking him, give me some quotes, give me some maxims. And Seneca says, you seem to think that there's some like best parts of the books that we could single out. It's all good stuff. So that said, it's my great honor to be able to introduce Christopher Gill. One of the high points of going to Stoicon 2018 in London was getting to spend a bit of time together and interview him about some of his work, and then going out for a beer afterwards as we met up with some of the other people. Chris is a really great person, a conversationalist to chat with, and he's also arguably one of the people who has been most centrally important in the development of the modern Stoicism organization over time. He's been a great guiding force, and you could say an embodiment of prudence. So he's a founding member of modern Stoicism. He's also emeritus professor of ancient thought at the University of Exeter, which has its own story. I mean, that was where the first conferences were cited, right? And originally, Stoicism Today was a blog cited at the University of Exeter. He has written many articles, a number of books, so I'm not going to try to summarize all of them. But he did point out that he's got another book coming out very soon, Learning to Live Naturally, Stoic Ethics and Its Modern Significance, with Oxford University Press. I believe that's coming out this fall. Is that right?
Yeah, soon.
Yeah, and then he's also working on another book as well, an introduction to Greek ethics, so much broader thing, sort of like your sources of the self.
Stoic ethics, just okay. Stoic ethics, just okay. Stoic ethics. So that's enough. That's enough.
Yeah, it's and well needed. People have been asking some questions. Oh, what do the Stoics think about this? Well, then we can send them through that book, right? Chris has also made a lot of contributions behind the scene as an editor, as an organizer, doing the kind of work that in academics we call service. And it's really been of great service, not only to his university and academia in general, but to the broad Stoic community, and through that to the world. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Chris, and I'm very much looking forward to your talk.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your kind introduction. Thank you and Andy for setting up this event, and with Phil. And also thank Brittany, who's just given that beautiful talk, for providing some wonderful illustrations with my slides, which I hope will make my presentation much more engaging than it would have been otherwise. Okay, so I need to share screen. Okay, just a moment. Let me just set this up in the approved fashion. Share slideshow. Okay. I'm looking
under slideshow and hit start presentation under the slideshow menu.
Slideshow, okay. Oh, okay. Play from start. There
Play from start.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, great.
Looks great. Thanks, Chris.
Okay. I'll just try going. Okay, that's working. Okay, so in this talk, I want to explore three kinds of care. Care for ourselves, for each other, and for our world or environment. I think that many of us can see that each of these kinds of care have a moral claim on us and merit our attention. But being aware of this, and also conscious of other kinds of demand on our time and energies, can induce a sense of moral panic. How can I genuinely and seriously express these kinds of care without being pulled in competing directions? So my question is this: can Stoic ideas and practice help us to hold these claims together and so convert this sense of moral panic into a more constructive and coherent pattern of objectives and motives? My answer is yes, very much so. Stoicism was famous in antiquity for what is sometimes called joined up thinking, and for giving a unified and connected account of knowledge as understood by them. Stoic ethics also advocated what you might call joined up living, that is, acting in a way that gives our lives coherence and focus. Indeed, the goal of human life was sometimes defined by Zeno, founder of Stoicism, simply as consistency, though it was also sometimes defined in more complex ways. This unifying and integrating quality applies to Stoic thinking about care. In ancient Stoic writings, the first two ideas, care for yourself and care for others, have a prominent place, as Brittany has just brought out. They form part of their thinking about ethical development, especially the theory of development as appropriation, oikoiosis. As well as emphasizing the importance of both kinds of care taken separately, the Stoics also discussed how they should be integrated with each other, a question which is closely linked with their theory of virtue, another central topic in Stoic ethics. The third idea I want to discuss, care for the natural world as a whole, doesn't play an important role in ancient Stoic ethical thought for a very good reason, explained later. Much more prominent is the idea in ancient ethics that nature cares for us, that is, for human beings and other forms of life and natural entities. However, the idea of nature in general is closely linked by ancient Stoics with human ethics, including the ethical themes of care for ourselves and others. And we, modern thinkers, can use these links to construct what would be a reasonable Stoic response to the modern problem of breakdown in environmental stability and balance. So I think these three kinds of care can be formulated in terms of Stoic ideas in a powerful and instructive way. I also think that the Stoic framework of thought can help us to see how these different kinds of claim can be coherently integrated in our thinking and living, and thus how a potential feeling of moral panic can be converted into a sense of purpose and constructive action. I start by discussing care for ourselves and others, and the relationship between these two kinds of care before turning to care about our world. The ancient Stoics saw these two kinds of care as basic motives inbuilt in all human beings. In fact, they saw them as inbuilt in all animals. The most obvious manifestation is, regarding care of ourselves, the instinctive motive of self-preservation, and regarding care of others, the instinctive desire for sexual intercourse, procreation, and care of one's offspring. These instincts are shared by human beings and other animals, but in human beings, these motives develop in more complex ways that reflect our distinctive character as both rational and sociable. This process of development forms part of the important Stoic theory of appropriation, oikoiosis, which I'll say more about shortly. Now, in thinking about these Stoic ideas, it's tempting to identify these two motives, care for ourselves and others, with the familiar modern distinction between egoism or selfishness and altruism, unselfish generosity. That is, between a bad or at least primitive motive and a good, ethically developed one. And if we do make this identification, this brings up the problem I'm raising here. How do we hold these two motives together, since they seem to point in quite different and competing directions? But identifying these two Stoic motives with egoism and altruism is, I think, a mistake. The Stoic motives are seen as universal, inbuilt features of human psychology. In themselves, they're neither good nor bad. They only become good or bad in the course of human development. And both care for ourselves and care for others have good as well as bad forms of development. What are the good forms of development of these two motives? There's a helpful discussion of these in Book 3 of Cicero's On Ends, which means on aims or goals in life. Care of oneself starts with the primitive instinct of self-preservation. And then, as human beings develop rationality, this becomes the desire to acquire the things that make up a normal human life, what the Stoics call natural things or preferred indifference. These are things such as health, property, having a family, and being respected by other people. Human rationality is naturally expressed in what the Stoics call selecting between these natural things. And if ethical development goes well, we select in a way that expresses the best possible features of a human life. That is, we select in a way that expresses the virtues. We express the four cardinal virtues: wisdom, courage, justice, and moderation or self-control, that taken together cover the four main areas of human experience. Also, and this is a crucial and much stressed point in Stoicism, we come to recognize that what really matters in human life, what makes the life a good one, is not just selecting or obtaining the natural things, but doing so virtuously, wisely, courageously, justly, moderately. As the Stoics put it, virtue, and not the natural things, is the only good thing, and living virtuously, the only proper overall goal of a human life. Now, there's a lot one could say about this aspect of Stoic thinking on development, but I just want to highlight one point. Developing care of yourself in this way should not be seen as a form of selfishness or egoism. That is something that's ethically inferior or bad. On the contrary, caring for yourself properly, your health, your property, your family, looking after social respect, is a way in which you can progress towards the best possible human life, one shaped by the exercise of the virtues. So Stoic self-care consists in caring for yourself in a way that enables you to make this kind of progress, which culminates in caring for yourself as a rational and social agent, aiming to live a life shaped by the virtues. However, to make full sense of this aspect of development, we need to take it in conjunction with the second strand of appropriation, care for others. Cicero, in On Ends 3, has a separate account of care for others in its basic and its developed forms. For human beings and other animals, the basic form of this care is the instinctive desire for sex, procreation, and care for offspring. But in human beings, care for others is a broader and more pervasive motive, expressed in various forms, including involvement in family life and in different kinds of community. And the Stoics, unusually in the ancient world, believed that human beings have a natural disposition to care for other humans in general and to regard them as part of a worldwide family or citizen group. So the developed forms of this motive can include any and all of these kinds of care. Regarding this kind of care, then, there's again just one point I want to underline. Caring for others in Stoic terms is not altruism, again, in a modern sense, if this is taken to be a motive that is inherently good. The various forms of caring for others that the Stoics discuss may or may not be ethically good. Caring for others, family, friends, fellow citizens, refugees, human beings in general, is only good if the caring is shaped by the exercise of the virtues, wisdom, courage, justice, and moderation, which are seen as forms of expertise in leading the best possible human life. So some forms of care for others would be bad if they were based on ethical mistakes or confusion. There's a further implication of this point. Although Cicero in On Ends 3 discusses care of oneself and others separately, we need to take both points together to form a complete picture of Stoic ethical thinking on ethical development. Care for others, the second strand of appropriation, is only expressed properly if we incorporate the process of learning about the crucial importance of living virtue in the first strand of appropriation, care of oneself. And there's no way in which we can learn what it means to live virtuously unless we also incorporate forms of caring for others as well as oneself. How can we make any sense of justice, of learning about justice, for instance, purely in terms of thinking about care for yourself? In other words, care for yourself and care for others are inevitably intertwined in a human life. And the proper ethical development of these two forms of care are also intertwined. And in Cicero's On Duties or on Obligations, these two motives are presented in interconnected form, as I'll bring out shortly. Well, what's the relevance of these points for the role of Stoicism in helping us to hold together different moral claims, which is the point, the basic question I'm looking at here? First of all, in the Stoic framework, caring for yourself and for others are not in themselves competing or antagonistic claims in the way that egoism and altruism are. On the contrary, caring for yourself and for others in their developed form are interdependent and require each other for completeness. What holds them together is the exercise of the virtues. Both care for oneself and care for others needs to be expressed in a way that involves the virtues as a matched set, that is, aspects of wisdom, courage, justice, and moderation. These connections between care of yourself and others, and between both of these kinds of care and developing the virtues, underlie the version of Stoic ethics we find in Cicero's On Duties, especially Book 1. This work, which is more practically oriented than Cicero's On Ends, is potentially more helpful as a guide to putting these Stoic ideas into practice. I'll just highlight 3 points in the work, the last of which may be especially helpful for putting Stoic ideas into practice. At the start of Book 1, Cicero presents the two basic human motives, care for oneself and others, as fully intertwined and as forming the psychological basis for the development of the 4 cardinal virtues: wisdom, courage, justice, and moderation. Secondly, throughout Book 2, Cicero discusses each of the 4 virtues and discusses the kind of actions associated with them, and uses this kind of discussion as a mode of Stoic guidance on practical decision-making. A striking feature of this account is that he describes each virtue in a twofold way. First of all, giving the standard Stoic definition of each virtue, and then highlighting a second strand of the virtue, which expresses an active desire to benefit other people or society in general. For example, courage, which Cicero describes as magnanimity, is defined both as emotional resilience in facing danger and also as being positively motivated towards socially beneficial objectives. Justice is analyzed as giving each person her due and also as being actively motivated by generosity or liberality towards other people. Moderation is presented as effective management of your own emotions and desires, and also as respect and consideration in our treatment of other people. Wisdom in Book 1 of On Duties is discussed twice, first in terms of the desire for knowledge, and secondly, in terms of the use of knowledge to benefit other people. Now, we can connect this twofold analysis in Cicero with the Stoic stress on the primary motivational role of care for ourselves and others. Developing the virtues, as they are initially defined by Cicero, expresses the desire to care for yourself in the sense of living the best possible human life, one shaped by the virtues as a mode of understanding. And developing the virtues in the second sense expresses the desire to express the virtues in the best possible way, and to do so in a way that's intertwined with the best possible form of care for yourself. The combination of the two helps us to work out and work towards what I earlier called joined up living or consistency, which is one way of formulating the Stoic conception of happiness or the goal of life. A third idea we meet in On Duties is this. In discussing how to develop the virtue of moderation, Cicero suggests that we should think of ourselves as having 4 roles, personae, in life, and we should work towards achieving consistency between them. One role is a general human one, as a creature that is rational and sociable and capable of developing the virtues. The second role is unique to each of us as individuals, consisting in our distinctive talents and inclinations. The third role is our current social situation. And the fourth role is the pathway we have set for ourselves, our career or chosen life pattern. We have the best chance of achieving consistency in life, what I'm calling joined up living, if we aim to make decisions which are compatible with playing all these 4 roles at the same time. Now, this idea, the 4-role theory, is a highly suggestive one for practical decision-making in a Stoic style. And it's also one that can help us bring together the developed expression of care for ourselves and for others. The first role, which covers the virtues, involves both kinds of care, care for ourselves and care for others. And the other 3 roles, in different ways, take account of our special individual features, while also referring to our involvement in social relations and communities. So the 4 roles express in another way the interplay between these 2 kinds of care, while the combination of them helps us to hold these 2 kinds of care together. So far I've talked about care for ourselves, and I've talked about care for others. The third kind of care I'm concerned with is care for our world or environment. I'm assuming that for any reasonably informed and thoughtful person in the modern world, it's obvious that being environmentally responsible constitutes another substantial moral claim. However, this can easily present itself as yet another moral claim that we have to try and meet, and can contribute to what I described at the start as a kind of moral panic. I've suggested that Stoicism can help to supply a framework for helping us to combine and synthesize the claims of care for ourselves and others, an alternative to the standard modern antithesis between egoism and altruism. Can Stoicism also help to respond help us to respond to the claim of environmental responsibility, and do so in a way that can be integrated with meeting the claims of care for ourselves and for others. Now, I think the answer is yes, though this is in some ways surprising, because the ancient Stoics did not have to confront the environmental crisis that we are facing. They did not have to face the looming threat of global warming and climate breakdown, of which we are already seeing clear indications in every part of the world. Nor did they live in a world where the domination of human beings had already produced a massive loss of other kinds of animal and living creatures, as it has for us. Similarly, the ancient Stoics were not living with the knowledge that these environmental disasters, which threaten the future of humanity, are themselves the direct consequence of human action since the Industrial Revolution, and are especially the result of carbon emissions from our use of fossil fuels. Given this major difference between the Stoic worldview and our own, why should we think that Stoicism can help us incorporate this further moral claim alongside others? I think there are several reasons for thinking that Stoicism can be helpful in this respect. These reasons center on Stoic thinking about nature and also their ideas about the relationship between the natural world and human virtue and happiness. For one thing, the ancient Stoics saw the natural world as being of inherent value and not valuable only because of its usefulness to human beings. They also saw the natural world, the cosmos, as the highest embodiment of structure, order, and wholeness in a way that contributes to making it inherently valuable. These ideas are most evident in their writings on theology and physics, especially Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, Book 2. Modern environmental ethics can be based on a wide variety of arguments and theoretical positions. But the idea that the natural world is of inherent value, apart from its value to human beings, is prominent in many versions of modern environmental ethics. The Stoic worldview offers a powerful statement of this idea. It also gives eloquent expression to the idea that the natural world constitutes a kind of coherent order and system. And this Stoic idea underlines the extent to which climate breakdown and global warming represents the collapse of the natural order. Of course, the Stoic worldview is in itself outdated by modern scientific standards, but it can nonetheless offer a powerful visionary picture of what is valuable in the natural world and what is threatened by environmental disaster. What about care for the environment and the natural world, as distinct from caring for the environment for the sake of human beings? Is this an idea that Stoicism can help us to formulate? Well, this isn't an idea which we find in quite this form in ancient Stoic writings on the natural world and ethics, such as Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, Book 2. Much more prominent, in fact, is the idea that nature as a whole, providential nature, also seen as a kind of embodied divinity, cares for human beings and for all other aspects of nature, including other animals, plants, and elements such as air and sea, and enables them to exist and flourish. However, as I've just stressed, human beings in the modern world have gained a mastery over the natural world, which is radically different from anything known in antiquity. So the idea of human beings caring for our world as a whole makes much more sense now than it could have done for them. Also, ancient Stoicism provides certain ideas which can help us, moderns, to formulate the idea of care for our world. The Stoics stress the idea that human beings are distinctively rational, and that this rationality enables human beings to exercise a degree of mastery within the natural world. As I've just noticed, they also emphasized, the Stoics emphasized, that the natural world has its own value and goodness, and that it represents a paradigm of coherence, of structure, order, and wholeness. Hence, on Stoic grounds, we can form the idea that we should use our distinctive human rationality not only in caring for ourselves and for others, other human beings, that is, but also for the natural world of which we form an integral part, and which has its own value and goodness. And in this way, we can internalize or reciprocate the care which nature as a whole has for us. In particular, we can and should do everything we can to undo the damage to the natural order we have produced by human action. The ancient Stoics also maintained that virtue and happiness depend not just on harmonizing ourselves with the best qualities of human nature, but also with those of the natural universe as a whole. That is, order, coherence, and providential care for everything within nature. Now, modern scholars have debated about precisely what this Stoic idea is, this linkage, this harmonization between us and nature. And they've also debated about whether this is something we can now accept from a contemporary standpoint, given the difference between an ancient and modern worldview. But the idea that human happiness is, in part at least, a matter of living in harmony with the natural world, rather than in damaging disharmony with it, as much human life is at present, is another potentially powerful and visionary idea for modern environmental ethics. So I think that Stoicism can offer in these respects strong support for those who advocate giving a very high priority to environmental considerations in our public and private decision-making, and a much higher priority than most individuals and governments currently give to this. However, this again raises the problem of integrating our moral claims and the danger of seeing environmental considerations as yet another claim, something else we've got to, as it were, worry about, and one that we may feel we cannot meet alongside existing claims. Now, can Stoicism help with this problem? I think Stoicism can help in several ways. As I've already suggested, Stoicism helps us to recognize that there are valid ways of expressing both care for ourselves and care for others, and of reconciling or combining these types of care. In the light of Stoic ideas, we can see environmental responsibility not so much as a separate and additional claim, but rather as another way of expressing care for ourselves and others in a valid way. As the effects of global warming become ever more evident, as they certainly were this summer in many parts of the world, we can increasingly recognize that environmental responsibility and trying to lead a sustainable life needs to form an integral and important part of our lives. Living sustainably should be an integral part of taking care of ourselves in the practical sense of supporting our health, property, and well-being. And living sustainably should also be an integral part of taking care of others. Living sustainable should be an integral part of taking care of ourselves in the practical sense of supporting our health, property, and well-being. That is what the Stoics call the natural things towards which human beings are drawn. And living sustainably should form an integral part of taking care of ourselves in a deeper sense, that is, of leading the best possible human life, one shaped by the virtues. Also, living sustainably should form an integral part of taking care of others, including our children and grandchildren, though global warming is no longer a problem which lies in the distant future. Here too, as often elsewhere, the Stoic idea of the kinship or fellow citizenship of all human beings can have an important role. We need to be aware that our actions and those of the communities of which we form a part have an impact not only on us, but also on others directly affected by the carbon emissions and the other environmental damage which we produce. So this is a case where a single action or type of action, that is living in an environmentally sustainable way, can serve both as a way of caring for ourselves and others, and also for our world. Another kind of connection lies in living in line with the virtues in Stoic terms. This forms the crucial link between proper or valid forms of care for ourselves and care for others, and the same goes for care for the natural environment. The idea of virtue is more commonly associated with actions affecting others, or perhaps ourselves. But in the modern situation, especially, it makes sense to extend our thinking about virtue to our relationship with and care for nature as a whole, or at least those parts of nature which we can affect in a positive way. Now, in Stoic thinking about virtue, there's one idea that that's particularly useful for this purpose. Although the four cardinal virtues cover different broad areas of human experience, the ancient Stoics believed that any given virtuous act involves the exercise of all four virtues in varying degrees. This is the Stoic theory of the unity or interdependence of the virtues. This idea applies to all aspects of human life, but I think it has a special value in defining the different but related qualities involved in choosing to act in an environmentally sustainable way. Take, for instance, the decision to give up a mini break vacation in an attractive but distant location, involving long flights, use of large purpose-built hotels in remote settings, and other activities with a significant carbon footprint. The alternative might be, for instance, taking an outdoors holiday in countryside in your own region. Now, making this environmentally better choice, the sustainable choice, can be understood as involving all four areas of virtue. It involves wisdom in reaching a better grounded decision, and courage in facing of sticking up for your principles, perhaps in the face of the disappointment of family or friends. It also involves justice in taking account of the environmental impact of your actions, something which affects everyone in different ways. It also involves moderation or self-control in giving up something often seen as pleasurable. There are, of course, various ways of applying the idea of the virtues in connection with environmental action. But the Stoic approach, in terms of the unity of the virtues, brings out in another way their stress on joined up thinking and joined up living, and on holding together the various factors and qualities that are of most genuine value in our lives. The Stoic approach also shows how living in a more sustainable way helps us to hold together the objectives of caring for ourselves, others, and our world in a coherent and considered way. I close this talk by considering the environmental implications of a Stoic ethical idea noted earlier. Sorry, that one. Supposing that we have decided that environmental factors should play a bigger part in our decision-making than before, how should we put this into practice? More precisely, how do we do so in a way that respects the other ethical priorities we have? The four roles theory can help here. Let's suppose that our first role, our common human role, consists in exercising virtue in an environmentally sustainable way, the kind of idea I've just illustrated. The next thing is to take account of the other three roles, our individual character and talents, our specific social situation, our deliberately chosen course of career or life path, and work towards consistency between all four roles. Now, if we take all these factors into account, some people will aim at exercising environmental virtue by involvement in eco-demonstrations or by becoming active in the Green Party. Others by discussing the question with family or friends. Others will do so by simply building environmental considerations into their decision-making on each occasion, alongside and interconnected with their existing ethical aspirations and objectives. The four-role theory, like other aspects of Stoic ethics, doesn't claim to offer a single answer to moral dilemmas, doesn't offer a precisely formulated set of moral rules. What it offers is a framework for giving our lives coherence and focus, and helping us to integrate powerful and well-judged objectives, such as that of exercising care for ourselves, for others, and our worlds. Thank you for your attention.
All right, well, thank you very much for that talk. And we do have some really good questions lined up for you, Chris, some of which kind of come together, I think, in interesting ways. So we'll start with one from the YouTube chat from Catherine. What are your thoughts respecting a gender overlay around giving? That is, that women can be socialized to overgive to conform to gender specific roles around being good or nice, so that I guess the real difficulty or the effort, or however you're going to put it, for caring falls more squarely on women's shoulders than on men's shoulders. And we could apply this to other differentials as well. So what would Stoicism have to say about that?
Well, I think one of the things I like about Stoicism is that it is a kind of universalism. So Stoics see all these characteristics that I've been talking about. They apply to men and they apply to women equally. So it's a gender neutral ethical theory. So caring, the kinds of caring I've been talking about, they belong to men and women equally. Now, obviously, in any given society, there's a whole sort of range of social factors and constraints which might affect that. But fundamentally, the Stoics want to say that we're all capable of the same kinds of care. We're all capable of this kind of ethical applying care to our ethical framework. Now, I mean, that doesn't, I'm not saying that's easy to put into practice, but I'm just saying that as a theory, as a philosophy, it takes us quite some way. And I suppose you could apply the four, well, I'm trying to think if you could apply the four roles theory in this way, but I suppose the problem there might be that it might seem to re-import the social question of social convention again. But I think anyway, I think the universalism of Stoicism is a starting point.
Okay. So here's another one coming from Alison McCone. And it's sort of a challenge. She says it's a very sad fact that many carers are capable of mistreating the people in their care. A complex issue, I know. Professional carers in my country work often in very poor conditions. And I think that's certainly an issue here in America as well, that those who are tasked with caring often don't have the resources to do so. I mean, is that a matter of justice then for Stoics?
Well, I think it is a matter of justice. Yes, it's a matter of injustice. And I think that's stressing the importance of care and care for ourselves and for others, and seeing how important these are might be a first step. Yeah, think again about one of the things I talked about earlier on was the distinction between virtue and the indifference. That is the idea that there are certain natural things we go for. And one of the problems in not just our society, but all societies, is that people tend to treat the indifference, the preferred indifference, as good. So they value certain things, and often they value status, they value money, and they value status. And so they don't, as it were, stand back and try and locate these things in a larger framework, and one that can enable you to exercise the virtues. So I think if the reason we're not paying carers enough is because we don't value them, and the reason we don't pay them enough is because we don't value the activity they're doing, and we don't do that because we don't really think about what care means and what it is to care and how important care is for ourselves and for others. So I think it's a question of trying to get to a kind of moral, get to the kind of moral core of the matter. If we really do think that what matters more than anything else is exercising the virtues, then this is going to make a big difference to the way we act as a society, the way we act as individuals, what we are prepared to pay for, what we're prepared to do. So I think again, I think the Stoics have a lot of really good starting points for addressing that kind of question.
So there are a number of questions that would be a good follow-up about specifics in that, but there is also one that has to do specifically with indifference, coming from Greg Lopez. So according to Diogenes Laertes, if he's a reliable presenter of Stoic doctrine, and I think he probably is, moral progress, prokope, is one of the preferred indifference. So Greg says, how do you make sense of the Stoics' form of care you're describing being good, while progress toward them being something that's a preferred indifferent, not a good per se?
Okay, so when I said it was a good thing, I wasn't speaking in complete consistency with Stoic doctrine. I was saying it is something that we should strongly. Something I want to recommend. It's what the Stoics would have called, in a technical way, an appropriate act, and it's also a way of making progress. So that classification of preferred indifference is quite of progress as a preferred indifference is well, initially it seems quite puzzling, but of course it's a preferred indifferent compared with virtue. So it's something we should want. It's something just as we want health, we want property, we want to make progress. Making progress towards the virtue is a good thing, but is desirable, let's say. Making progress towards virtue is desirable. It's something we should want to include in our life. Yes, okay. So I should I should talk more carefully when in describing Stoic theory.
This is one of the things that is quite tricky when we go to the Stoic text, right?
Yeah.
And when we're explaining it in a popular way, it's hard not to use the terminology of good, bad, better, worse, right?
Yes, and also Chrysippus himself sometimes does this. It is hard to say that, because we tend to think, well, what we should do is act virtuously, But what the ancient Stoics say is what we should do is work towards virtue, is make progress towards virtue. But so it isn't, but nonetheless, make it that we do need to keep alive the fact that making progress matters very much. It's a very important thing for us to do as human beings.
Yeah, I would also say too, and let me see if I can like bounce this back to you and have you say a bit more about that. In order to, the Stoics are quite clear, and so is Cicero in presenting them, that virtues largely bear upon indifference.
Yes.
Prudence is about how
Yes.
we use things.
Yes, exactly. Virtue isn't something up in the void. It's not just a kind of activity that has nothing to do with human life. We express virtues by making appropriate choices about health and property and social status and how we relate to other people. Virtue is getting stuck in there, as it were, in the stuff of human life, but doing so well, doing so expertly. Yeah, that's right. So that it's a mistake for us to just kind of contrast, in a certain sense, acting virtuously and acting as regards indifference.
So here's a question from Catherine from the YouTube. How do we prioritize who we care for first and above all? If we all live fully sustainably, this might limit our immediate self-care or care of our close others, and that this sets up some, moral dilemmas or conflicts. So how do we address that?
Well, this is very much my theme. That's exactly what I've been trying to explore. So I think the first thing is to recognize that all these elements, care for yourself in all the various senses that have, care for others, and care for our world, that these are valid claims, but we have to give a unity and coherence to them. And so that's, I think, where something like the 4%er theory comes in. So we have maybe this general idea of working towards virtue, but then we've also got to think about who I am. What sort of person am I? It's no good suddenly saying, oh, well, we ought to be more heroic if you're actually not a very heroic person. Or it's no good saying, oh, I've got to be brilliant if you're not a brilliant person, or if you're, or whatever it might be. So you've got to think about who you are. If you want a job that requires you to be 8 foot tall and you're only 5 foot tall, you've got to think again. So you've got to think about who you are. And then you have to think about where you are. If you're a refugee in Bangladesh, the options open to you are going to be very different from if you're a wealthy person living in Chicago. And then, of course, you may have a career or project. So that's why the Stoics think you've got to bring the 4%er theory can show us that it's a matter of bringing these factors together. But so I don't think we have to, because it's easy to think, oh, I've got to live a sustainable life. Well, that means I've got to live for everyone. I've got to think about the whole of humanity. And then again, this induces the sense that I've talked about, a kind of moral panic. Oh my God, who am I? I'm thinking of this person, that person. Well, no, you're just you're trying to live your life in a way that builds this consideration, or your sense of the importance of this, builds that into your life in the specific decisions you're making. And we all make decisions every day that have a bearing on ourselves and others and on the environment.
There's a very interesting question in the YouTube chat from Orlando saying, can education be considered care? And then they follow up by saying, is the way we invest in education and we treat teachers a lack of justice, or just part of our economic model?
Well, a lot of questions there, aren't there? But certainly on the first question, education, the Stoics typically, like other ancient philosophers, they see education as a form of care, very much so. And then the question of how you value it. Well, then again, it's this question of what value you're placing on care, and of course, the kind of care that is informed by the virtues. From the Stoics, nothing could be more valuable. So So therefore, we would perform the kind of actions that are going to enable this very valuable activity to go forward, rather than say, as we do in our society, we give great value on people who make loads of money and are good at maximizing their money. And so we have these giant inequalities in our society. But if we lived in a more consistently Stoic way, we wouldn't do so. We would value activities that do express these kinds of care and do so virtuously. There's a lot of other things we might do too, but that's enough.
Okay. Here's a question from Dan, my fellow co-organizer of the Milwaukee Stoic Fellowship. For the Stoic approach to the environment, your example only deals with your own choices for yourself.
Yes.
But the biggest issue is not individual impact, but the emissions of a small set of companies. Can you talk about this issue and then what putting it into practice would involve?
Well, obviously, I think it's a multi-level thing. I think that unless you do actually yourself try and practice this, that if you then go out and engage in demonstrations and political protests and so on, there's something wrong, isn't there? There's a lack of integrity. So what we're looking for here is integrity. Integrity is an enormously important virtue, I think, for the Stoics and in life. So I think, yeah, it's multi-level. And again, I think the 4 personae theory, some of us are going to be people who are really good at, like Greta Thunberg. She's a great eco warrior, but we're not. Yeah. We can't all be eco warriors. But that doesn't mean that we can't do something in terms of acting sustainably in different ways in our own contexts. In a small way, I think it's useful for us to be discussing it right here at this moment. At least 100 people are thinking about this question at this moment. So I think it's a matter of, of contextualizing your concerns and integrating them. Again, joined up living. That's what we should be doing.
So would you say, to go back to one of the questions about carers, I think it was Allison may have said, carers are often burnt out and, they have difficulty because they're not being properly supported. So maybe each of us has to decide, like, well, how much can I do reasonably given who I am? Like you said, we can't all be Greta Thunberg. And maybe I can't even be quite as good as my neighbor next door, who's much more consistent with doing caring things at this point in time, but I can add more gradually. Is that the sort of approach you're taking?
Well, are you talking about care in general? I mean, I think that there's a kind of ambiguity, isn't there? Some people by care, they mean things that we in our society call care or social care.
Okay.
But I think the Stoics would look, they want to say, look, care is a much broader notion than that. A politician can care for the people, or can care. Care for the country makes it sound too dominating, but there are many different kinds of care. An educator can express care for yourself and care for others. So care is a broad, wide-ranging notion, and we should value most kinds of care that are informed by wisdom, courage, moderation, and self-control.
Here's a question that just came in from Damaris. How can you care about others when they do not care about you? And the example given, I think, is one that's quite relatable. Slaving away in a company that would replace you within a week. Are you, and let's follow up by saying, are you, making yourself much more vulnerable by caring in situations like that?
Right. But you might argue that you're caring best for the ruthless employer by forming a union and opposing, by joining a union and opposing them. That you're exercising care for the ruthless employer by showing the ruthless employer that this is not a good way to care for others. So caring doesn't mean just lying down and being trampled on.
Yeah, I suppose you could also say too that maybe you don't have to care. You know, you have to allocate where you're going to care. So you don't care for the oppressive institution
Sure,
that you're stuck in, and you care for the
exactly.
people in the cubicles next to you, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Care isn't like a sort of hose that you're that you're spraying around. Caring is something deeply built into human life with all its complex forms of activity. It doesn't replace. It's not replacing other things. It's just one of the ways of analyzing the kind of basic motives and activities that we have. So certainly, yeah, fighting against injustice is something that the Stoics, the ancient Stoics, valued and did. They were well-known troublemakers in ancient Rome. They were always getting into trouble because they were all standing up to the emperor. They were standing up to the emperor. They were getting exiled because they stood up to the emperor. They walked out of the Senate. They made difficulties. And so they got killed. They were required to, so fighting for injustice is not an unstoic activity.
Well, that is all the time that we have. We're more or less on track. Thanks so much, Chris, for this wonderful presentation, and to everybody for your rich questions on this.